Hi guys, this is Ms. Kurganin. I'll be leading you through your note catcher today on central places, the gravity theory, and just general information on chapter 12. This is one of the harder units, I believe, so that's why I thought it would be good for me to record. That way you can stop and try and fill out this note catcher as needed. I'm only going to have you know just a little bit of this information here. What were the earliest cities and types of early services and how that compares to present day. So let me go into that PowerPoint first. Let me find where did I put it? Right up here. All right, so the very earliest cities would be Athens and Rome. And then I would also have you write down this super cool city called Ur. And early cities, why did people like go to cities? It was to have these activities done for them: consumer services, public services, and business services. So in your notes, you would write down what are you coming to town for? Well, you're going to come and bury your dead or have some type of religious rite performed over it. Or you would be coming to cities because that's where the manufacturing center was. You might need an iron worker to help, an ironsmith, or you might need a shoemaker to give you the shoes. People had specialty crafts in the cities. Maybe you have to get some horseshoes, so you got to go shod your horses there. So early consumer services met societal needs. Early public services would be what was provided by the government, and often the government was tied to the religious organization. So, maybe there was a healing ceremony or some type of religious ceremony that you would come to town for. Maybe there's holidays or events that required your participation. And then early business services often involved distributing and storing food. And I'll note that early medieval cities, and most of these cities, were really just about horse travel wide. And what I mean by that is your protection. A lot of these cities were walled and protected with an army, but that, how far could you travel in a day with your horse? That was about as far equidistantly as you could even protect. So most cities back then were only horse riding long. But as time has grown, the United States right now has the majority of its population involved in consumer services, 44%, 24% in business services, and 17% in public services. And most of our growth has been in the service sector. And if you look at how our economy has been changing, some jobs like finance have stayed about the same through time. Like here's the last 25, 30 years. But government jobs, I think it's interesting as far as public services from the government, they have been growing, and there's a lot of people on the government payroll, which was why President Trump in his last administration wanted to shrink the amount of people that are on government payroll. He wanted to drain the swamp. These are examples here of consumer services, so wholesale, resale, retail, leisure, health, and private education. That's where the majority of our people are employed. And then these are our business services, finance and professional business. Right, next. So in talking about central places and services today, we're going to start first in discussing Kiowa, or Kiowa, I don't know how to say that here in Colorado, Parker, Denver, and New York. And so I want you to take a couple minutes here and look down through this list. And I tried to make it easy by just labeling them A, B, C, and D. And come off the call maybe for a second so we can discuss which cities are you going to find these services. So which of these four are you going to find gas stations? Well, probably in all four. Where are you going to find a grocery store that sells the basics like bread and milk? Okay. But then like down here, where are you going to find the lawyer for international litigation? Are you going to find that in Kiowa? Are you going to find it in Denver? Maybe, definitely in New York. So why don't we come off the call for a second so we can discuss this as a group, and then we'll come back on and finish the rest of the lecture. So if you had a chance to analyze that, what you noticed is that there was a difference between higher order services and lower order services. And so there seemed to be some essentials that you could find in every single city. So that's your conclusion, that the basics like bread, milk, gas, you can pretty much find that in every location. But there's going to be higher order services like luxury fashion stores and lawyers for international litigation that are only going to be in your most densely populated and highest populated places, which leads us into the central place theory. So as we write down notes for this central place theory, I find it super interesting that we live in hexagons. We live actually in like a beehive colony. And so if I pause here and just look at the idea of supermarkets and think about like where your supermarket is closest to your house. Is it Whole Foods? Is it Safeway? Is it what used to be Albertsons, which is really just another Safeway? Is it Alfalfa's? And what you'll notice is that those are equally spaced out. What is really interesting about the United States is our market areas are pretty spaced out. So you really don't need to drive more than 6 miles ever for your groceries, that you are always living within 6 miles of the closest grocery store because it has identified you as a consumer and has placed itself where you will be the market. And what does that mean? That means that we end up living in these hexagons where our market is equally distributed and our services are equally distributed, and that our market area is composed of the range and the threshold and the population density. So we're going to take some notes on central place theory, and you are going to be filling out your worksheet first with just notes on what is this and how does this help explain our our existence here in a developed country. So the first thing that you're going to write for number 1, central place theory helps explain what? You would write down that it describes the size, distribution of urban locations based upon those locations providing goods and services. So it is a theory that helps show us where businesses are and why. Who created this theory? Well, this guy. This guy is Walter Christaller. Notice that he lived kind of at the turn of the century here. And he was a German geographer, isn't it? I find this interesting. Aren't they all German geographers? I feel like they all are. And he was studying settlements in southern Germany. And he noticed that there seemed to be these regular expected patterns of location where places were located. And so here are some terms that we're going to need to write down. And they're down towards the bottom after you look at the honeycombs. It says define hinterland. And a hinterland is an area where a city is the dominant producer of a particular good or service. So you'd write that down. And then I'll pause. I'm going to get you range. And here's your next term is range. Range is a distance a consumer will travel for a particular good or service. So like if I think about like IKEA, I would actually drive all the way down to IKEA just to get IKEA, but I'm not going to drive all the way down to, what is that, like Lakewood for like milk. I would only go like maybe 6 miles max to get my milk, but I will go all the way down to Lakewood for that Fuffelflugger or whatever is that cabinet. Threshold. A threshold is the minimum population needed to keep a business in operation. And some of our restaurant industries right now are lacking the minimum population needed. Like in the time of COVID right now, the threshold has diminished, and then that's what's making it hard for businesses to stay in operation. The last term that you would write down is called hierarchy of market centers. These are settlements. You would write down for the definition, range in size from large cities with many services, and that's why we did that little brainstorming at the beginning, to small hamlets which offer few services. Now, this idea of hamlet, remember this guy was German, so he talks about the hinterland. That sounds German, doesn't it? The hinterland and the hamlets as a way to explain where are these services and villages located. And the hierarchy, like top down, in your notes, you would write down city's going to be the biggest. Next comes town. Next comes village. And then the smallest is the hamlet. So would you write city, town, village, hamlet? Okay, now we're going to look at some diagrams here. Okay, so I had to find the diagrams that I needed to show you. So this is the shape of the hinterlands. And so if you've got cities are your biggest, then your towns, then your village, then your hamlets, and you have your services being provided in those different locations, what Chris Strahler noted is that there seemed to be a regular pattern of where you could find these things available. So here are your biggest cities, and they seem to be equally spaced out. And then your towns are the next biggest, and those are equally spaced out. And then your villages, and then tiny little hamlets. So then how are all of the goods and services distributed? So you've got your capital city that's going to have the highest order goods. You're going to have your large towns and your small towns. So like this is Denver. Then you're going to have some things available in large towns like Boulder. You're going to have some stuff available like in Louisville. And then you're going to maybe have like some things available in like Erie. I'm going to call Erie like a hamlet. And so there's going to be this regular distribution of goods and services that in a developed country like the United States, you'll find a regular order and distribution of these goods and services. So now I'm going to pause and I'm going to have you fill out the chart down at the bottom. What are high order goods and low order goods? So in that chart down at the bottom, a high order good, it's going to have a high price, like a car, low frequency of purchase, again, like a car. You don't buy that all the time. You buy that like every couple of years or, well, actually, my cars are probably 10 years old. A high threshold, what that means is you need lots of people to buy that and to keep that company going because they're expensive. And then large consumer range. Range is the distance you're willing to travel. You're willing to travel a long way to buy that car. So a car is a good example of a high order good. But then low order good, like I think of like my milk. It's going to have a low price. I buy it a ton because it goes bad. So it has a high frequency of purchase. It's got a low threshold. I'm not willing to go very far to get my milk. Like again, I'm living in about a 6-mile radius. And then a small consumer range means that there's so many people that need milk, they really don't need tons of people because it's just noted that lots, you're always going to be buying milk. So they're not so worried about getting the consumers all the way down there to buy your milk at Safeway. So in this diagram here is where you are going to label. So this is the city center. So right here you'd write city central place. And then in Chris Strahler's theory, surrounding that is called the hinterland. So this is the market area, hinterland or market area. This is city central place. This is hinterland market area. And that city center is going to have a term he calls centrality. It's going to have almost like a gravity, like a drawing to it, because there'll be a draw to those higher goods. And that it'll have a field of influence, again, which is the market area, to seek those higher goods. What you would draw here is these are towns. And then again, in the towns, these are the hinterlands around those towns. So they're smaller than the cities. Again, it goes city, town, village, and hamlet. And so he said that they're not really circles, they're hexagons because they overlap each other. Like, really, we're living in circles, but when those circles overlap, they become a hexagon, which I'm going to show you on one more slide. So this is what I was talking about on why they're hexagons and why we're living in hexagons. So you've got these circles, but the circles overlap, these market areas overlap. And then if you kind of cut off the edges, that's where you get your hexagons. So kind of like bees, we're living in a bunch of hexagons. And if you don't believe me yet, I'm going to show you in a breakdown in this PowerPoint where they analyzed Colorado and IKEAs and McDonald's. So for your McDonald's, your fast food in McDonald's here, McDonald's has a range of 3 miles. That means that like 3 miles around you is where you can find your McDonald's. So think about it for a second. Is there a McDonald's 3 miles away from you? Yes. And what is the threshold? How many people do you need to keep that McDonald's in business? About 10,000. So when you start to look at where are the McDonald's, there's going to be more McDonald's for every 10,000 people down here in Denver, and then you're going to have less McDonald's out here, but there does seems to be a regular distribution of McDonald's. Let's look at the next. Let's look at movie theaters. So the movie theaters here, where are movie theaters, which, by the way, have lost their threshold to stay in business. I think we're going to see a lot of movie theaters declining because of COVID. But what would be the range? How far are you willing to go to see a movie? There, again, probably in maybe like a 5 mile radius, but like, unless it's a really good movie, you're maybe willing to go to Westminster. So movie theaters have about a 10-mile range and a threshold. They need about 500 to 150,000 a night to stay in business. So again, that's why they're losing their threshold. Okay, and then let's think of IKEA. IKEA has what would be called a higher order service. So, you're only going to go to IKEA maybe once a year. It's going to be like you're driving to New Mexico because it seems like it's like, almost an hour away. And I said it was in Lakewood. No, it's not even in Lakewood. It's like way the heck down in Centennial. And what would be the threshold for IKEA? How many people would you need to keep an IKEA in business shopping at least once a year? We're probably thinking probably in the millions. And then what is going to be the range? Well, from here, like in Louisville, Superior area, all the way down there, that's going to be at least a 50, 60 mile drive. So you're going to have a long range. And then when you start to look at like where the IKEAs are, they are heavily, distributed in these populated regions, less of them where we don't have a lot of population, lots of IKEAs here. And so they've placed themselves again in a regular pattern according to the central place model. So we are, in a weird way, living in central place theory, that you're always in access of Starbucks. Like, how close is your Starbucks? Like, close. There's like a Starbucks outside of a Starbucks. Like, you're going to find a very short range for your Starbucks. And then you do not need a large threshold because people have a need for that Starbucks. I would even call that a low order service because we really need our Starbucks. So the last part of your notes asks about assumptions and relaxed assumptions. And with any model in AP Human Geography, there's these kind of idealized circumstances, and then there's these assumptions that it would work in these idealized circumstances. So one of the assumptions is that this would work where transportation is available. So you could write down transportation's available, that population is equally distributed for the most part, that you're in a somewhat developed country, that people are willing to minimize the distance to be traveled, that you don't want to go too far, and that the businesses want to maximize their profits. So that is some of the assumptions here, that you want to maximize profits, that you don't want to drive too far, and that you have also the money to buy these things. Those, and I'm not going to go over more than that. There's some relaxed assumptions, though, that could be behavior and preferences. Like right now, the central place theory wouldn't necessarily work with COVID quarantine restrictions. And some relaxed assumptions include that you may have some wealthy and non-wealthy areas that just can't buy the high order goods. So where does this not work? Let me go to that slide where it doesn't work. Is if transportation is not available like we have here in North America, if the wealth isn't evenly distributed, if people don't have the same purchasing power, and if competition isn't the same. But for the most part, this is a theory that allows you to have market analysis, that you look at your market area and then you try and figure out the best place for your business or your industry where you can maximize your profit from your consumers. And for the last part of your notes, so the type of service I went over, I showed you McDonald's. Your range would be 3 miles and you need about 10,000 people to keep a McDonald's going. Your movie theaters generally need about 10 miles of range and anywhere from 500 to 1,500 people to keep that business running. And then for your IKEAs of the world, your high order services, your range is 50 miles and you need about 2 million people to keep that business going. So that's called your central place theory, and that's going to lead us next to the gravity model, which is Ullman's theory. So this next theory, this one's hard for me because this involves math, and I prove all the time why I'm not a math teacher. But the first thing asks you in your note catcher to define the gravity model. So this is a model that has the potential use of determining which services you should put at a particular location. So you use the central place theory to figure out what is the need. And then now you've got to figure out, okay, exactly where am I going to put that service? And so you have to figure out where is the gravity. And the idea of the gravity is it predicts, that's the next one down, predicts spatial interaction. So to define the gravity model, it holds potential use of a service at a particular location. And then the gravity model predicts spatial interaction with this formula. You take the population, how many people are in one place at the town or the village. You take the population of the second place, town or village, you times it together, you divide it by the distance squared, and then that mathematical computation is your gravity. Examples of spatial interaction. This is the third notes down. This could include your daily commute, like how far are you willing to drive and travel? And it could also predict international trade for your spatial interaction. So the gravity model, predicting spatial interaction, trying to figure out how far are you willing to drive or travel for that service, is something that looks like this. And down a little bit lower in your notes, it asks you to try and draw the gravity. But here someone has already calculated the percentage of influence towards those services. So And I know this is sounding complicated, but just think about where you're living right now. You live in a suburb. And that's probably because I bet your parents used to commute to Denver, and that the where you are living is perfectly situated where it's just far enough away that you could still get to work, just far enough away to where you could still reach school. It's available for the shopping, but like, and your social recreation. So where you're situated is close enough to the mountains, close enough to the Denver. You're kind of in a sweet spot. So Ullman's theory is looking at spatial interaction controlled by flow. So, do you have complementarity, transferability, intervening opportunity? This all sounds super hard, but really, is there draw to that place? And remember when we were looking at Alfred Weber's, like trying to figure out exactly where to stick your business in the sweet spot? Ullman's theory is that we will live in a sweet spot where we have the greatest pull of gravity. So the gravity model will illustrate population of one times the population of the other divided by the distance squared, or inversely proportional to the distance separating them. It's a mathematical computation. It's very hard for me, but you would write down in your notes, the gravity model is and then there's a blank there. You write down mathematical formula that shows the interaction between two places. It is, next word, directly proportional to the sizes of their populations, and next word in the blank, inversely proportional to the distance separating them. It creates a bond. So this is what you were supposed to draw. So there's Big Eye, has a lot of gravity. Think about like the sun. We're all like, we're getting pulled into orbit around the sun. But then there's also Jupiter out there. Jupiter is strong enough to like be kind of pulling in moons, but we're just far enough away from Jupiter and the sun. We're in the sweet spot. That's our home. So your business or where you live can also be in that sweet spot, closest to one place, closest to the other, and then you triangulate to get that sweet spot, which is going to have the balance of your populations and your distance. How can you apply this? Let's look. All right, this is where you're going to probably get lost because I struggle with the math. But if you were trying to figure out the gravity and which town has the stronger pull to place your business, and maybe you're trying to decide between El Paso, Texas, Tucson, Arizona, first thing you have to do is figure out what are all their different populations. So El Paso, Tucson, times them together and divide by distance squared. So you could figure out El Paso's population, here's Tucson's population, times them together, here's the distance squared, and then that math works out to this. Okay, what does that mean? Well, then you have to maybe compare that to Tucson. Oh, see, this is where you lose me. I'm like, I don't know what the end product. All right, I had to look back at my notes. I think if you do this, comparing each of these towns, El Paso to Tucson. Oh wait, no, shoot. See, I don't know what I'm doing. So this is where I'll just throw my hands up and say, I don't know. I can't figure really out how you figure out gravity. I guess I'm reading this slide and there's New York and LA, and here's the population times the population divide by the distance. It gives you a number. Clearly, I'm not in business because like this actually looks like really hard to do. 52,000. Oh, what has the greater pull? I guess, I don't know. Which is why I leave it as an extra credit. You don't feel very confident, do you? That I don't I don't know how to calculate gravity, but there is an opportunity where you could try. Maybe you are smarter to figure this out than I am. That in your note packet, there's an extra credit there. If this kind of makes sense to you, go for it. You can do the extra credit. Here it is. You get to see, I'm going to abandon, but here's the best I know. You can try and figure out what is the gravity of Denver to these cities, trying to figure out like where is the best place to put your R&B studio. So Austin to Denver, Cheyenne to Denver, Chicago to Denver, Los Angeles to Denver, which is going to have the largest gravity. Here's where that mathematical number would go. Population times the population divided by the distance squared. I can help you out by looking up this. I clearly cannot do the math, but if you can figure out the math and put your answer here and you are able to tell me which one has the highest gravity, awesome, extra credit for you. If you're like, nah, sounds really hard, then I get it. I think it's really hard too. You'll just turn in these notes as is. All right. And thanks for bearing with me. These are really hard concepts. Bye.